In this lecture, we're going to look at one of the newest features introduced in Vue called the teleport component. Teleporting is a design pattern for moving an element from one location to another while still keeping the hierarchy of components intact. Teleporting was introduced to make it easier to structure a project without using Vuex or emitting events through multiple components. We'll look at the problem teleport's address before we get into them. For this example, we'll be working with the modal component we had last time. We'll remove the paragraph tags from the app component because we don't need them anymore. We know that scrolling can be enabled or disabled. Currently, the way we're opening the modal is by listening for the click event on the button. This event will toggle the open property to true. The changes are then communicated to the modal component. It's a very simple setup. In larger apps, this doesn't scale well. In most cases, you'll likely want to open a component from a child component instead of the app component. We kind of saw an example of this when we worked on the music application. The authentication modal was opened from the header component and not from the app component. Let's try opening the modal from a child component to visualize this better. In the components directory, create a file called action.vue. We'll scaffold the template and script blocks for the component. The name of the component will be called AppAction. From the app component, we'll cut the div tag surrounding the button. We'll paste this into the action component's template block. In this scenario, we're going to pretend we have a child component that will open the modal. The job of the action component is to tell our application to open the modal when its button is clicked. Typically, you may want to do this when the user performs an action such as clicking a link or submitting a form. Since we moved the button into a child component, we won't have access to the open data property. We'll emit an event from the child component for the parent component to listen to when the modal is opened. On the button, we'll change the value for the event listener to call a function called openModal. In the options, we'll add the methods object where we'll define the openModal function. From the function, we'll call the this.emit function to emit an event called open. Back in the app component, we'll need to import the action component. Next, we'll add the components option to register the action component. Up in the template, we'll load the action component where we previously cut the button. Lastly, we'll listen for the open event on the action component. If it's triggered, we'll update the open property to true. We'll get the same behavior we had last time. Let's go to the browser to test if the modal still works. Clicking on the button will result in the modal opening. Everything seems great, so what's the problem? Conceptually, this is what our application looks like. The app component is the parent component to the modal and action components. It holds the open data property, which it sends down to both components. The action component emits an event telling the app component to update the open data property to true. A simple representation of what's going on in our app. The problem with this approach is it doesn't scale. Let's imagine we have another component called contact form. It houses the action component where it's still responsible for opening the modal. This will mean the data will need to be passed down and emitted twice. This problem gets even worse if we add more layers. The way the components are structured is very disconnected from one another. One solution to this problem is to use Vuex. It works great because we don't have to worry about communication between components. However, it should only be used for global state. If we add state to the store, we'll probably need to add actions, getters, and mutations as well. This can clutter the application store. It makes sense to use the store if various components can open the modal we're creating. If the modal is going to be opened by a single component, storing its state in view X isn't the best approach. Well, what is the best way to approach this then? In a perfect world, the modal component will sit as the child component to the component that's responsible for toggling its visibility. With this approach, we don't have to pass down data continuously through layers of components. Events don't need to be emitted in a chain. The store stays clutter-free. It makes sense to structure a project like this. If we have a component that needs to open a modal, the modal should be the child of the component toggling its visibility. In this case, the action component should be the parent of the modal component. It doesn't matter how complex the architecture of our application is. As long as the modal component is the child component to the component toggling it, our code remains simple and manageable. The job of the app component is to load the action component. It doesn't need to store the data or listen to events. There's one problem with structuring the app like this. Let's look at what that is. We'll restructure our app to look like what we saw in the previous slide. In the app component, we're going to move the registration of the modal component to the action component. First, we'll move the import statement. Next, we'll remove the modal component in the Components option. Afterward, we'll go back to the Action component to add the Components option. We'll register the modal component there. We can begin to load the component. We'll go back to the App component to cut the usage of the modal component from the template. We'll switch to the Action component to paste the usage in the template. Since the modal is being loaded in from the Action component, we'll need to store the state of its visibility. In the App component, we'll completely cut the data function and paste it into the Action component. The click event in the template can be updated to set the open data property to true. We can remove the methods option from the action component altogether. We don't need to emit an event anymore. Lastly, in the app component, we don't need to pass down data or listen for an event on the action component. We can remove these bindings from the component. Let's try testing this application in the browser. The modal will still work even though it's nested inside the action component. This is because modals usually have a fixed positioning. The positioning allows us to freely place the modal anywhere in the application. However, we're not entirely free from the parent component. Let's go back to the editor to find out why. Back in the action component, we'll apply a style attribute to the root element. We'll set the opacity property to 0.5. Back in the browser, we'll see that the button is semi-transparent. The button's appearance is something we might want to have. If we click on the button, the modal will appear semi-transparent as well. This is the problem with loading the modal as a child component of the action component. Here's the visualization again. It's better to structure things like this because we'll know exactly what's toggling the modal's visibility. The problem is that the styles affect the modal. This can result in an unexpected appearance. This problem can be fixed with Vue's latest feature called teleports. A teleport will take an element from one location and move it elsewhere. This will change how the document looks, but without having to restructure our app differently. Let's look at how this works. The best place to load the component without external styles interfering with its appearance is at the root. The body element is the container for the overall application. It's the perfect place to load a modal. In the action component, we'll wrap the modal component with the teleport component. The teleport component has one property called to. The value for this must be a query selector of the element we'd like to move the component to. We'll set this to body. The contents of the teleport component will be moved to the root of the document. In the index.html file, we have such an element. The component will get loaded in this location. Let's check the browser to see if this works. The button will remain semi-transparent. If we click on it, the modal will appear. It's still functional, and it's not being affected by the styles of the parent component. It's fully opaque. We can use the developer tools to see what's going on. Under the Elements panel, we'll find the Modals element. Initially, we left it empty. Peeking inside, we'll find the Modal component. It's been moved from one location to another. We can look inside our app to find the modal is no longer where we placed it. This is the power of the teleport design pattern. The modal is functioning because it still accepts the props from the parent. It can continue emitting events that the parent component can listen to. We didn't have to make changes to the component to get this working. It can still be used the same way we used it before. Let's switch over to the View Developer Tools to view the hierarchy of components. The modal component is still a child of the action component. View will keep intact the relationship between components even though they've moved. The teleport component was introduced to address the problem of keeping component relationships closer together without them affecting each other visually. You don't have to use teleports, but they can make your code much more organized. One last thing I want to note is that we can teleport multiple elements to a single element. We don't have to create multiple locations for every new modal we create. We can continue using this one location to load all our modals.